I was driving to the airport when I realized my passport was still at home. But when I walked back inside and heard my husband talking upstairs, I stopped. I moved closer. And what I heard made my hands shake and my heart turn to ice. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're watching this, please hit subscribe to her voice. I was halfway to the airport when I realized my passport was still sitting on the dresser. My heart sank for a second, not from panic, but from that quiet kind of annoyance that makes you sigh and shake your head at yourself. I turned the car around, telling myself it was fine. I had time. I'd grab it and be back on the road before my husband even noticed I'd returned. When I walked through the front door, everything felt too still. The kind of stillness that makes you instinctively soften your steps, like you've entered a secret. The house smelled faintly of coffee and his cologne, that sharp, clean scent I used to find comforting. Then I heard him, his voice, upstairs. At first I smiled, thinking he might be on a work call. But something about his tone, it wasn't his business voice. It was lighter, almost tender. I stopped in the middle of the hallway, keys still in my hand, and listened. His words came through in soft, low rhythms. I couldn't make them all out, but the ones I did changed something inside me. He laughed. I hadn't heard that laugh in months, not that way. It was warm, playful, intimate, and then a woman's voice floated through, gentle and familiar. My chest tightened before my mind even caught up. Sophie, his assistant. For a moment, the air felt too thick to breathe. I took a step closer to the stairs, then stopped. I could hear the way he said her name, the way she answered. Every sound pressed deeper into me, like tiny needles under my skin. My hands started to shake. My throat burned. I didn't want to hear more, but I couldn't move. My heart kept beating, slow and heavy, as if it knew something my mind wasn't ready to accept. He told her I'd be gone for a week. He said it with a laugh, that I'd never suspect a thing. And she laughed too. That was the moment the world shifted. The life I thought I knew, the safe, ordinary life we'd built together, cracked in half right there on those stairs. I stood frozen, listening to the man I'd shared 32 years with speak about me like I was an inconvenience. Something cold spread through me. Not anger yet, just ice. A quiet, steady coldness that numbed everything inside. I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. My suitcase sat by the door, still zipped, waiting to leave. But suddenly I knew I wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. I picked up my passport from the dresser, placed it gently in the drawer, and whispered to myself, "Let the trip wait." Because something inside me, quiet, trembling, and new, told me this story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I stood at the bottom of those stairs listening, not out of curiosity, but disbelief. My husband's voice carried a softness I hadn't heard directed at me in years. Every syllable cut deep, not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it. He told her how relieved he was that I'd be away for a week, that he could finally breathe. I felt something in me crumble. The man I'd built my life around, my partner, my best friend, was upstairs whispering secrets to another woman in the house we built together. Sophie's voice was faint but unmistakable. She laughed, the kind of laugh that trails off into a whisper, the kind that carries intimacy. And David's voice followed, low and teasing. He called her baby. My stomach tightened. For a moment I thought I might faint, but I gripped the banister to steady myself. I wanted to burst in, scream, demand answers, but I didn't. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was something deeper. After 32 years with the same man, you learn to read the spaces between his words. And what I heard in that moment wasn't love. It was arrogance, the certainty that I'd never find out. I took a step backward, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The sound of their laughter chased me through the hallway like a cruel melody. I slipped into the kitchen, careful not to make a sound. My reflection caught in the glass door. I didn't recognize that woman. Eyes wide, lips trembling, face pale as paper. I whispered to her, "Don't cry. Not here?" I sat at the table for a long moment, frozen. The coffee mug he'd used that morning still sat by the sink. His lipstick-stained napkin, mine, lay beside it. That image twisted something inside me. How many mornings had he kissed me goodbye and then called her before even reaching the office? The pain came in waves, first confusion, then anger, then a hollow stillness that scared me more than either. I thought of all the nights I stayed up waiting for him to come home from late meetings, all the dinners I'd eaten alone, convincing myself this was what marriage looked like after 3 decades. I'd believed him because I wanted to, but now that belief was gone. The house felt smaller, suffocating. Every photo on the wall seemed to mock me. I walked into the living room, and there we were, smiling in Charleston, hand in hand on our anniversary. I touched the frame. My fingers trembled. "You liar," I whispered, but it came out softer than I expected. More like a prayer than an accusation. I heard the creak of the floor upstairs, followed by hushed goodbyes. Panic flickered. I couldn't let him see me like this. I slipped out the back door quietly, my breath shaky but steady enough to survive the moment. The autumn air hit my face, cool and sharp, grounding me. Out there, standing in the garden, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't confront him. Not yet. Because the truth deserves more than anger. It deserves precision. And in that cold morning light, I decided something I never thought I would. I was going to learn who my husband truly was, piece by piece, until he had no lies left to hide behind. I walked back inside a few minutes later, pretending nothing had happened. I placed my keys on the counter, poured myself another cup of coffee, and smiled when he called down, asking if I'd forgotten something. "Yes," I said softly, looking up at the ceiling. "But I found it." He laughed, unaware of the storm that had just begun in his own house. For a long moment after he hung up, I stood there at the bottom of those stairs, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat. It was slow, heavy, like a drum echoing through a hollow space. My hand rested against the doorframe, trembling so hard I could hear the faint tap of my wedding ring against the wood. That sound, it broke something in me. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The air felt thick, like the house itself was holding its breath with me. Upstairs, his footsteps creaked softly as he walked toward the bedroom. I heard a drawer open, then close. The smallest details imprinted themselves in my mind. The rustle of fabric, the low hum he made when he was pleased. He was humming. I turned my head slowly, staring at the family photos on the wall beside me. There we were again, David, me, and Emma, our daughter, smiling by the water in Charleston. I remembered that day so clearly. He'd told me I was his anchor, his calm in the storm, and I had believed him. My knees felt weak, so I slid my hand down the doorframe until my fingers brushed the cool hardwood floor. For a second I thought about running upstairs, confronting him, tearing down every lie between us. But another voice inside me, a quieter, older one, whispered, "Not yet." That whisper steadied me. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, the kind you take before walking into a church or a courtroom. When I opened them, the tears that had threatened to fall were gone. What replaced them wasn't anger, it was something colder, sharper, awareness. I moved silently across the living room, my bare feet sinking into the carpet. The sun had shifted through the blinds, laying pale stripes of light across the furniture. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar anymore. Even the ticking of the clock on the mantel sounded different, too loud, too slow. When I reached the kitchen, I set my hand flat on the counter just to feel something solid beneath me. My hands were still shaking, but my mind was already working. 32 years together. A lifetime of trust built on small moments. Coffee at dawn, notes on the fridge, long drives home from family visits. And now, it all felt like a stage play that I'd been watching from the wrong seat. I poured myself a glass of water, though I didn't drink it. I just stared at the reflection in the surface, the faint shimmer of a woman trying to understand where she'd gone wrong. The truth was, I hadn't done anything wrong. I had simply loved a man who had forgotten what love costs. When I finally heard his footsteps coming down the stairs, I straightened up and wiped my face. He appeared in the hallway, phone in hand, smiling the same easy smile he'd worn for years. "Everything okay, Evie?" he asked, using the nickname he always did when he wanted to sound warm. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Just forgot my passport," I said softly. He laughed, shaking his head. "You'd forget your head if it wasn't attached." I smiled again, but inside, I felt nothing. Just that cold clarity spreading wider, steadier. He kissed my cheek before heading out to the garage, and I stood perfectly still until the sound of his car faded away. Only then did I let my body tremble. My hand covered my mouth to keep from making a sound, though there was no one left to hear me. That was the morning I learned that silence can hurt just as deeply as betrayal, and that sometimes the calmest people carry the loudest storms inside them. When his car finally disappeared down the street, I sank onto the couch, still clutching my keys. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was hollow, echoing. Every corner of the house seemed to hum with what I had just heard. I sat there, staring at my suitcase by the door, the one I'd packed so carefully for my trip to Chicago. My passport was back in the drawer, and suddenly I knew I wouldn't be needing it anytime soon. I picked up my phone and pretended to scroll through flight alerts. If David checked in later, I wanted everything to look normal. I sent him a quick message. "Flight delayed. Might be late getting out." He replied within seconds, his usual short tone. "No problem." Stay safe. Those 2 words, stay safe, felt like a joke now. He'd said them so many times over the years, with that easy charm of his, but they'd never felt emptier than they did that morning. I sat for a while just breathing. My heart was beating slower now, but every pulse felt heavy, deliberate. I looked around the living room, the photo frames, the throw blanket draped over the armchair, the book he'd left half open on the coffee table. All the quiet domestic signs of a marriage that looked so ordinary from the outside. I got up, picked up the suitcase, and rolled it back toward the bedroom. Every step felt measured, like I was moving through someone else's life. When I reached our bed, I sat down on the edge and ran my hand across the quilt. It still smelled like him. I didn't cry. Not yet. My body refused to. Instead, I opened the suitcase and began unpacking slowly. Each folded shirt, each pair of shoes, each little piece of who I thought I was. I placed them back in drawers, one by one, until the suitcase was empty again. Then I zipped it shut and slid it under the bed. If I was going to stay, I needed a reason. Not to forgive him, no, that was long gone, but to understand, to see clearly, maybe for the first time in years. Because for too long, I'd been half awake in my own life, accepting his excuses, filling the quiet with hope. I walked to the window and looked outside. The neighborhood was the same. Children riding bikes, a dog barking in the distance, the mail truck rattling past. Ordinary life kept going, indifferent to what had just cracked inside my chest. Then, almost without thinking, I went to my dresser and pulled out an old leather-bound notebook. It had been years since I'd written in it, back when I used to keep small notes about Emma's school days, family dinners, birthdays. I opened to a blank page and wrote the date, Then slowly, I began to write what I'd heard. Every word, every detail. I wanted proof, not just of what he'd done, but of how I felt. Because I knew one day those words would matter. By the time I closed the notebook, the sun had shifted low across the floorboards. I sat there in the fading light, feeling something strange rise inside me. Not peace, not rage, but a kind of quiet determination. That night, when David came home, I greeted him at the door with a calm smile. He asked how the airport was, and I told him about the delayed flight. He nodded, poured himself a drink, and talked about his day like nothing had changed. But as he spoke, I watched him differently. The way he avoided eye contact, the way his words felt rehearsed. I knew every movement, every breath. I smiled when he smiled. I laughed at the right places. But inside I was studying him, like a stranger I'd just met. And as I lay in bed beside him that night, listening to his steady breathing, I made a silent vow. I would not leave in anger. I would leave in truth, not yet, but soon. The next morning, the house felt colder than usual. Maybe it was me. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring at the steam rising from the cup like it might carry answers. David had already left for work. He'd kissed the top of my head, same as always, his voice easy, his scent still familiar. But now that I knew what lived beneath that calm surface, every gesture felt rehearsed, practiced. I opened my notebook again, the one I'd started the night before. My handwriting looked steadier than I felt. The words I'd written seemed almost foreign, like someone else's story. He laughed. He said he could breathe when I'm gone. Reading them in daylight made the truth heavier, not easier. That's when it started, my quiet collection of evidence. Not revenge, not yet, just understanding. Each morning, I wrote down the small things I noticed. The times he came home later than usual, the scent of a new cologne I didn't recognize, the tiny changes in his tone when he said my name. Little things most wives ignore because they want to believe the best. But I couldn't unhear what I'd heard. I found myself watching him the way a painter studies shadows, noticing what used to blend in. His shirts began smelling faintly of another perfume. His phone stayed closer to him now, never left unattended. Once, he smiled at a text during dinner, and when I asked who it was, he said, "Just work." But his eyes gave him away. They always do, eventually. That evening, I cooked his favorite, chicken piccata with lemon and capers. The meal, he always said, reminded him of our honeymoon in Naples. He came home, smiled at the smell, and kissed my cheek. "You're spoiling me again," he said. I smiled back, my heart steady, my mind recording every word. Over dinner, I asked about Sophie. Casual, light. "She must be keeping you busy with those new projects." He nodded quickly, too quickly, his fork pausing mid-air. "Yeah, she's great, efficient." His voice was flat, like a line he'd practiced. I didn't push. I just nodded, sipping my wine, pretending to listen as he talked about meetings and deadlines. Inside, I felt something different growing, a kind of clarity. The fog that had covered my life for years was lifting. Later that night, while he showered, I stood by the window with my journal open again. The neighborhood lights flickered outside. Somewhere a dog barked. I wrote, "He's getting careless." Lies don't hold the same shape when repeated too often. It wasn't bitterness that guided my pen. It was focus, a calm, deliberate knowing. Every truth I wrote down gave me back a small piece of myself. When he came out of the shower, humming softly, I closed the notebook and slipped it into the drawer beside my bed. He smiled and said, "You look tired." I just nodded and whispered, "A little." He turned off the light and fell asleep within minutes, his breathing steady and slow. I lay there in the dark, listening, my eyes wide open. I realized something I hadn't before. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. That night I decided I wouldn't run from this truth anymore. I'd let him keep building his tower of lies, brick by brick, while I quietly gathered every stone he threw away. Because one day soon, I would build something of my own, something solid, unshakable, and entirely free of him. It was a Thursday evening when the illusion finally cracked a little wider. David had promised he'd be home by 7. I'd even set the table, 2 plates, soft jazz playing in the background, candles lit. It wasn't love anymore. It was routine wearing the mask of affection. But still I waited. 7 passed, then 8. At 8:30, the candles had burned halfway down, their wax pooling like small sighs. When his car finally pulled into the driveway, I didn't move. I watched from the window as he sat there for a moment, checking something on his phone before stepping out. The porch light caught his face, calm, composed, like he hadn't noticed the hours slipping by. The moment he walked in, I smelled it. Not his cologne, something floral, sharp, unfamiliar. It wasn't just perfume. It was the scent of another presence, clinging to him like a whisper. "Rough day?" I asked softly, pretending not to notice. "Yeah," he said, dropping his keys in the bowl, loosening his tie. "Late meeting ran long." I nodded and smiled, though my heart beat louder than the ticking clock. "You must be exhausted." Dinner's still warm. We sat down to eat. He talked about work again, about deadlines, budgets, and new clients. His words were smooth, too smooth, like pebbles polished by time. I listened, nodding when he needed me to, memorizing the details he thought didn't matter. Every small inconsistency went straight to the pages of my hidden journal later that night. After dinner, he kissed my forehead, a gesture that once meant comfort. Now it felt like an apology for something unspoken. I could almost feel her ghost between us, the perfume still faint on his collar. Later, when he went to shower, I walked to the laundry basket, picked up his shirt, and lifted it to my nose. The scent was undeniable, vanilla with a trace of rose, not mine. I folded it neatly and placed it aside, not to confront him, not yet, but to remember. I sat down on the bed, opened my journal, and wrote, "He no longer hides well. Guilt has its own scent." The words steadied me. Writing them down made me stronger. I wasn't the naive wife who believed everything was fine anymore. I was the quiet observer, the woman who'd finally opened her eyes. When David came out, towel around his waist, he smiled like nothing was wrong. "You okay?" he asked. I met his eyes for the first time that night. "Perfectly," I said. He smiled again and turned away, completely unaware of the storm forming right beside him. That night, as he drifted to sleep, I lay awake tracing the cracks in the ceiling. I realized love can rot quietly, like fruit left too long in the sun. It looks whole from the outside until you touch it, and it collapses beneath your fingers. But here's the thing about decay. It makes space for something new to grow. I didn't know what that new was yet, but I could feel it waiting, patient and sure, just beneath the silence. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what I might become without him. I was curious. I told David one evening that I wanted to host a small dinner, to celebrate our marriage, I said lightly, letting the words hang in the air like a delicate glass ornament. He looked at me with his usual half-smile, a flicker of hesitation passing through his eyes, as if he sensed something beneath the calm surface of my voice. I didn't reveal anything, of course. I only smiled and said, "It will be nice to have everyone together." I spent the next several days preparing. The house took on a different energy. Soft light spilling from the lamps, the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers mixing with the faint aroma of my cooking. I moved through the rooms with careful grace, arranging the table, setting out our good china, and choosing a centerpiece that was understated but elegant. Every movement was deliberate, not for show, but as if the act itself carried quiet intent. When I spoke with Sophie and Mark on the phone to invite them, my voice was calm, warm, entirely without a hint of suspicion. I could hear Sophie's polite cheerfulness on the other end, and Mark's easy laughter. David stood nearby, sipping his whiskey, unaware of the thoughts quietly weaving in my mind. Even as the day of the dinner approached, I maintained my composure. I laughed when David made small jokes, allowed him the illusion of normalcy. Yet beneath the surface, I planned, observed, and considered every detail. The way Sophie might glance at him, the subtle cues that would betray her nerves, even the small habits of my own husband. I noted it all. On the morning of the dinner, I prepared the meal with meticulous care. Lemon butter salmon, roasted vegetables, a light dessert. I even polished the silverware until it gleamed. Every plate, every glass, every napkin folded perfectly, like a silent message I alone could read. By the time our guests arrived, the house smelled of warmth, home, and just a hint of something unspoken. The tension that comes before revelation. David opened the door, smiling, and Sophie stepped in with her husband. Mark. She was bright, careful, polished, a little too eager to charm the room. Mark, oblivious to the undercurrents, greeted me warmly, shaking my hand firmly. I returned their greetings with a calm grace, observing every subtle expression, every nervous gesture. As I led them to the dining room, I felt the quiet power settle inside me. This was not a confrontation. Not yet, it was preparation. Every smile, every polite word, every movement, all part of a slow, deliberate choreography. For the first time in weeks, I felt a subtle sense of clarity. The woman who had felt betrayed, powerless, and invisible was no longer entirely lost in the shadows. She had returned, steady and watching, aware of what others could not yet see. And as the first glasses of wine were poured, I reminded myself quietly, patience, observation, calm. Tonight would begin a new chapter, and I would not be the one left in the dark. Dinner began quietly, the clink of silverware against plates, the soft hum of conversation filling the room. I watched Sophie across the table, her laughter light but a little forced, the way her eyes kept flicking toward David. She was careful, trying to seem at ease, but her hands betrayed her. Small, restless movements, tapping against the table, brushing at her hair, adjusting the napkin in her lap. Mark, her husband, sat beside her, kind and polite, completely unaware of the tension that hovered invisibly between the three of us. He asked questions, nodded, laughed at small jokes, and I found myself almost envying his oblivion. Sophie seemed to relax slightly when he spoke, but I could see the glances toward David, the quick, fleeting expressions that only someone observing closely would notice. I felt a curious mixture of pity and power as I watched. Pity for the woman who believed she was stepping into a world she did not yet understand. Power because, for the first time in weeks, I held clarity in a situation that had once left me dizzy and disoriented. I knew what they did not: the secrets, the lies, the quiet betrayals that had been hidden behind my husband's charm for years. David spoke easily, recounting a story from work, and Sophie laughed, leaning slightly toward him. I noticed the small things, the way his hand brushed hers, the subtle tilt of her head, the warmth in her smile that didn't reach her eyes. I sipped my wine slowly, my mind calm, cataloging each gesture, each expression. Every tiny detail would become part of the quiet knowledge I was collecting. It was not anger that filled me. It was observation, careful and patient. I let the conversation flow naturally, asked small questions, laughed at the appropriate moments. Nothing forced, nothing dramatic, only presence, quiet and deliberate. And through it all, I noticed how Sophie tried to charm the room, unaware that her charm held no sway here, not with me. I caught David's eye once across the table and allowed a faint smile to linger, polite but unyielding. It was a small claim, a gentle reminder that I was present, aware and watching. He tried to maintain his effortless composure, but I sensed a flicker of something, subtle unease perhaps, the first crack in the facade he had worn so carefully. As the meal continued, I realized something profound. Power need not be loud or confrontational. It could reside in calm, in quiet awareness, in the simple act of seeing clearly when others are blind to their own actions. And tonight, across that table, with Sophie unaware of the full truth and Mark lost in his own innocence, I felt that power settle within me. By the time dessert was served, I was no longer just a woman betrayed. I was a woman quietly reclaiming herself piece by piece, one observation, one small, deliberate moment at a time. The room seemed lighter, warmer, but beneath that surface warmth ran a current I alone could sense. A current of clarity, patience, and the slow, deliberate shaping of what was to come. As the evening unfolded, conversation drifted lightly from work to travel, from shared memories to small jokes. I listened carefully, noting every gesture, every pause. Sophie spoke animatedly about a recent business trip David had mentioned at work, her words casual but revealing. She didn't notice my quiet smile as I refilled my wine glass. "A week in New York," she said. "David couldn't tell Evelyn because of the surprise work meetings." I placed my glass down softly, letting the warmth of the wine linger in my hands. The room felt cozy, familiar, but beneath it ran a cold clarity that only I could sense. David laughed lightly, trying to steer the conversation, but the subtle slip had already reached me. It wasn't meant to matter perhaps, but it did. Each word a thread I could follow, a small knot unraveling the tapestry of deceit. Mark seemed entirely unaware, nodding and asking questions, his warmth and trust filling the space between them. I almost felt pity for him, for the blind faith he carried in his wife's intentions. Sophie, bright and ambitious, continued her chatter, but I noticed the little tells, the flick of her eyes, the slight hesitation in her voice, the careful phrasing she used to keep David from exposing too much, and yet, for the first time, I didn't feel the sting of betrayal as sharply. Instead, there was observation, awareness, and a kind of quiet satisfaction in knowing that I had begun to see clearly what others thought was hidden. Every glance, every laugh, every half-word whispered around the table became part of a collection only I could hold. I smiled faintly, small and controlled, as the evening wore on. It wasn't triumph, not yet, but the seed of patience and quiet power had been planted. I was no longer the one in the dark, no longer blind to the intricate dance unfolding around me. Sophie's slip was a tiny, delicate key, unlocking a doorway to understanding, and I knew how carefully I must step through it. The dessert arrived, a simple lemon tart, delicate and understated, served with grace. I noticed Sophie's eagerness to please, her attention to David, the way Mark watched, oblivious but trusting. And I realized then that this was my moment of quiet control, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through calm, deliberate presence. Every subtle clue, every unguarded word, was mine to hold, mine to observe, mine to use, not recklessly, but with intention. By the end of the dinner, I felt a strange mixture of warmth and ice, a calm awareness of the truths that had been revealed and the careful steps yet to come. This small evening, polite and ordinary on the surface, had become a turning point. And as I cleared the last crumbs from the table, I knew that patience, observation, and quiet strategy would be my allies in the days ahead. The next morning, after David left for the gym, I sat quietly in the study, letting the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the neighborhood settle around me. The house felt different in the stillness, heavy with anticipation. I opened his laptop slowly, deliberately, not out of recklessness, but because I knew it was time to face the truth fully. Emails filled the screen, months of them, polite and formal at first, gradually turning intimate, secretive, and unmistakably personal. I read line after line, letting each word sink in, memorizing dates, plans, hotel receipts, the names of places I had never been told about. Each message etched itself into my memory, not as betrayal alone, but as proof of clarity, evidence that had long been hidden from me. There was no rush, no impulsive reaction. I didn't cry, I didn't shout. I simply read. My hands were steady, my heartbeat measured, though beneath it all ran a quiet, simmering awareness. The emails told a story I already suspected but had not seen in full. David's charm, his seeming devotion, all carefully constructed, all carefully performed. And Sophie's voice, so carefully entwined in his words, felt almost tangible through the screen. I closed the laptop gently, letting it rest on the desk as I leaned back in my chair. For a moment the silence was complete, filled only by my own steady breathing. The betrayal no longer cut. It clarified. Each secret, each hidden meeting, each carefully worded message became a tool, a guide to understanding what I had allowed to go unnoticed and what I would now observe with precision. I thought of the past weeks, the forgotten passport, the overheard conversations, the quiet nights lying beside him while my mind worked quietly, painfully. I realized that for too long I had lived in half-truths, ignoring small hints, hoping charm and routine would cover the cracks. Now there was no cover, only the truth laid bare before me and the calm knowledge that I could respond with patience, strategy, and dignity. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling the warmth in my hands, the quiet clarity in my mind. Not revenge yet. That would come, carefully, deliberately. But for now, observation and understanding were enough. I had begun to reclaim myself piece by piece, turning what had once been a source of heartbreak into a quiet strength. The emails stayed in my mind, lingering like a subtle echo, but I didn't need to act immediately. The woman who once felt lost, betrayed, and powerless was beginning to return. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm, a quiet awareness that nothing hidden would remain hidden for long, and that I had finally stepped into the light of my own clarity. Later that morning, I found myself standing before the full-length mirror in our bedroom. The woman who looked back at me was someone I barely recognized at first, eyes steady, lips pressed gently, shoulders squared. I searched for the traces of the hurt and disbelief that had weighed on me for weeks, but they had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet awareness I had never fully possessed before. I studied my reflection slowly, taking in the subtle lines around my eyes, the soft gray in my hair, the calm steadiness in my posture. For too long, I had measured myself by his gaze, by the comfort of his presence, by the illusions I had allowed to shape my days. But now, looking at myself, I realized that nothing he had done could destroy the woman I was becoming. A small, Almost imperceptible smile curved my lips, the kind that comes not from joy alone, but from recognition of one's own strength, one's own resilience. I whispered softly, almost to myself, "He doesn't get to destroy me." The words felt strange, liberating, heavy with unspoken truth. For the first time since that morning at the staircase, I had spoken aloud, asserting quietly that I was here, fully present, and no longer blind to what had been hidden. The mirror reflected more than just my appearance. It reflected my choices, my patience, my careful gathering of clarity from the fragments of deception that had surrounded me. I allowed myself to breathe slowly, feeling each inhale as a small act of reclaiming my own power, each exhale a quiet letting go of the fear and confusion that had clung to me. I touched the glass lightly with my fingertips, feeling the cool surface, the separation between what I had been and what I was becoming. There was no anger, no desire to lash out, only calm resolve. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a spectacle, but the quiet realization that I had begun to reclaim myself, piece by piece with awareness and dignity. For a long moment, I stayed there, gazing at the reflection of a woman who had been hurt. Yes, but who was now awake, observant, and quietly powerful. The betrayal that had once felt like a storm now seemed like a guide, showing me what I needed to see, teaching me how to move with grace, patience, and purpose. And as I finally stepped away from the mirror, I felt a subtle but profound shift. The woman I had been, hurt, bewildered, betrayed, was still there, but she was joined now by someone stronger, clearer, and fully herself. I was no longer simply surviving. I was quietly, deliberately reclaiming the life I deserved, one breath, one observation, one intentional moment at a time. That afternoon, I made a quiet decision. I picked up my phone and dialed Mark Turner's number. I didn't need to say everything, not yet. There was power in subtlety, in letting others discover the truth at their own pace. My hand was steady, my voice calm as I greeted him. "Hello, Mark? It's Evelyn," I said softly, letting my words linger just enough to catch his attention. I could hear the curiosity immediately, the gentle shift in his tone, the slight pause that told me he wondered why I was calling. "I thought you might want to check your wife's calendar," I continued, careful not to reveal too much, only enough to nudge his awareness. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and I allowed it to hang there, measured and deliberate. The quietness carried its own weight, a weight that spoke of knowledge and observation, of the subtle truths I had been gathering over the weeks. Then Mark asked a cautious question, and I answered with gentle clarity, leaving just enough unsaid to make him think, to make him consider what might have been hidden before. I ended the call without drama. No accusations, no outburst, just a measured release of information, carefully metered. My hand rested lightly on the counter as I hung up, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction and calm control. For the first time in weeks, my nerves were steady, my breath even. The woman who had felt betrayed and powerless was reclaiming her agency, piece by piece. It was not revenge yet. That would come in its own time, with patience and care. For now, there was clarity, strategy, and the subtle satisfaction of having set the first domino in motion. Mark's curiosity, his awareness, would ripple quietly, slowly, until the truth could no longer remain hidden. I let the silence settle around me, deep and unbroken, and took a slow, deliberate breath. The knowledge that I had acted, thoughtfully, deliberately, without anger, brought a strange sense of peace. The storm that had once threatened to overwhelm me had quieted into a current I could now navigate, and I knew exactly which way I would move next. In that quiet moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: control, observation, presence. I was no longer adrift in deceit and betrayal. I had taken the first steps toward reclaiming my life, carefully, deliberately, and with a calm awareness that nothing hidden would remain hidden for long. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle shifts. David grew restless, small irritations flaring in moments that once passed unnoticed. He tried to fill the quiet with conversation, jokes, and small attentions, but there was a stiffness, an unease I had never seen before. I observed him carefully, letting him carry his discomfort while I remained composed, serene, and quietly watchful. Sophie's behavior shifted as well. Invitations canceled, small excuses offered, eyes darting a fraction too quickly toward her phone. The veneer of ease she had tried to maintain began to crumble in imperceptible ways. I noticed the patterns without needing to confront them, cataloging each gesture, each hesitation, each tiny reveal that spoke more than words ever could. I carried on with my days as usual, tending to the garden, arranging fresh flowers in the living room, brewing coffee slowly, deliberately. Each action was measured, calm, a soft reminder that life moved on, despite the undercurrents swirling around me. My composure became my ally, a quiet shield that allowed the walls around David's double life to weaken naturally, without force, without confrontation. There was power in patience, I realized. Not the loud, dramatic sort, but the kind that seeps into a room quietly, altering perception, shifting attention, and leaving subtle traces that cannot be ignored. Every polite smile I offered, every word carefully chosen, chipped away at the carefully constructed illusions, leaving David increasingly uncertain, Sophie increasingly anxious. I found satisfaction in the stillness. I didn't need to speak aloud, to demand explanations or apologies. The cracks were appearing on their own, as inevitable as dawn breaking after a long night. I allowed myself to watch them carefully, feeling a sense of calm that was entirely mine. The betrayed, confused woman I had been was fading, replaced by someone who could observe, act, and reclaim control without haste or anger. By the end of the week, I noticed David's eyes scanning the room differently, searching perhaps for signs I would not offer. Sophie's laughter became more forced, Mark more puzzled, and through it all, I moved quietly, carefully, ensuring that the subtle truths were revealed at their own pace, allowing reality to unfold as it must. For the first time in weeks, I felt no desperation, only presence, only quiet awareness. The cracks were enough. The slow unraveling, gentle but undeniable, was proof that patience and clarity were more powerful than confrontation. And in that calm, reflective space, I knew the next steps were entirely mine to determine. Deliberate, controlled, and quietly, perfectly just. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. Mark found the messages himself. I didn't orchestrate it. I only nudged him gently before, and he had taken it from there. The revelation came not with confrontation or noise, but in whispers, subtle conversations, and cautious glances exchanged among their circle. The truth began to spread like soft sunlight filtering through blinds, slow, deliberate, and undeniable. Sophie confronted no one. David received no accusations. Yet the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly at first, then with increasing weight. Office colleagues, friends, acquaintances, all noticed in one way or another that the carefully constructed illusions no longer held. The subtlety of quiet revelation proved far more potent than confrontation ever could. Meanwhile, I remained home. I tended my garden, each rose, each blade of grass absorbing my calm, deliberate attention. I watered, pruned, and planted with quiet precision, letting the natural rhythm of life around me mirror the quiet satisfaction settling inside. Peace enveloped me, steady and unshakable, as the ripple effects of truth unfolded beyond my walls. I allowed myself a private moment to reflect, to observe how power could reside not in anger, but in patience, in the gentle orchestration of presence and awareness. The betrayal that had once threatened to consume me became instead a guide, teaching me how to move with care, foresight, and quiet authority. David seemed oblivious to the real extent of the unfolding consequences. He walked through his days with a charm that no longer sufficed, a composure now brittle, shadowed by uncertainty he could not quite name. Sophie, trapped in her own web of half-truths, faltered subtly in her interactions, revealing the tension that even Mark, now aware, could feel without needing explicit explanation. And through it all I stayed calm. No raised voice, no accusatory words, only observation and reflection. Each moment, each subtle gesture became part of the unfolding story, as delicate and powerful as the growth of a new bloom in my carefully tended garden. By evening, I paused to look out the window, the fading light soft against the horizon. The truth, slowly and quietly, had begun to reclaim space. It was no longer hidden, no longer confined to shadows, and I felt, for the first time in weeks, that the calm, deliberate path I had chosen was working, the quiet justice that comes from patience, awareness, and measured action. David announced another trip. This time, he would go alone. I nodded politely, letting my face remain calm, my voice steady, while inside I felt the faint stirrings of quiet strategy. I would let him go, yes, but on my own terms, in my own carefully orchestrated way. That afternoon, I packed his suitcase. I did it slowly, deliberately, each fold and placement precise. Clothes neatly arranged, shoes polished, everything seemingly ordinary. And yet, beneath the surface, I slipped something quietly deliberate into the lining, a small, silent statement. Inside, I placed a printed photograph of the four of us at the dinner I had hosted weeks ago. Beneath it, in my careful, flowing handwriting, I wrote a simple message. I was home that day, too. Not anger, not accusation, and only a quiet reminder of presence, awareness, and the subtle truth that nothing escapes my observation. David did not notice immediately. He left hurriedly, suitcase in hand, eager to move on, unaware of the quiet revelation tucked inside. I watched him from the doorway, letting the calm satisfaction of subtle influence settle over me. It was not dramatic, not loud. It was simply deliberate, quiet, and entirely under my control. The house seemed softer, lighter, as I returned to my daily routines. Tending the garden, preparing tea, arranging flowers, each act a quiet affirmation of the space I reclaimed with each passing day. The small, deliberate action with the suitcase was a marker, a turning point, a signal that I was no longer simply passive, no longer confined to silent observation. I allowed myself to breathe slowly, letting the anticipation settle into a gentle calm. I did not rush the consequences. I only knew that this quiet statement, left in plain sight, would carry weight in its own time. It would reach him, perhaps through curiosity, perhaps through reflection, and the truth would unfold naturally, without my hand needing to raise in anger or confrontation. And in that quiet evening, I realized the strength of subtlety. Power could reside not in loud declarations, but in careful placement, in measured presence, and in the quiet knowledge that awareness alone can change the course of events. The empty suitcase, outwardly ordinary, inwardly deliberate, was proof that I had begun to shape my own path, reclaiming agency piece by piece, with calm, reflective intention. That evening, David returned from the airport, his expression tense, voice cracking slightly as he stepped into the living room. "How much do you know?" he asked, almost pleading, almost defeated. I met his eyes calmly, the soft light catching the faint gray at my temples, steady and unwavering. Enough to stop pretending. I said simply, my words deliberate, measured, calm. No accusation, no raised voice, only clarity, only quiet truth. For the first time in weeks, he realized that the careful control he had assumed over our lives no longer existed. My awareness, my observation, my quiet patience had shifted the balance in ways he had not foreseen. He paused, searching my face for signs of weakness, for any flicker of the woman who had once been bewildered and betrayed. But there was none. Only calm, deliberate presence. Only the knowledge that I had watched, waited, and understood far more than he had imagined. The suitcase he had taken now seemed like a symbol of the cracks in his carefully maintained facade. I had allowed him to leave, to believe he was free, only to show that I had already acted in quiet, unnoticeable ways that claimed power without confrontation. And now his return brought the inevitable realization, subtle, undeniable, and completely beyond his control. I did not need to explain everything. The emails, the messages, the dinner, the photograph, all were already understood in my silence. His guilt, his confusion, his quiet unease, all these were the natural consequences of his own actions, revealed not through anger or accusation, but through patience, presence, and quiet clarity. We stood across from each other in the soft glow of the living room, a silence stretching between us, heavy yet precise. It was the first time I felt entirely free within my own home, entirely in control of my awareness and understanding. There was no shouting, no pleading, no begging, only presence, observation, and the quiet unfolding of truth. In that silence, I realized that the power of quiet observation, combined with deliberate action, could unravel deception far more effectively than confrontation ever could. And as I watched him slowly come to terms with what he had done, I understood fully my strength lay not in rage, but in calm, in clarity, and in the deliberate shaping of my own life. The flight never needed to take off. The journey had already shifted, quietly, powerfully, and irrevocably, and I, finally, was the one holding the map. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply walked. Each step was deliberate, steady, and calm, as if the floor beneath me supported not just my weight, but the quiet reclamation of my life. David watched from the doorway, speechless, unable to grasp fully the shift that had taken place within me. The air between us carried the weight of weeks, months, years even, all the moments of subtle betrayal, hidden conversations, and quiet observation. And yet there was no drama, no spectacle. Only the calm inevitability of someone finally walking toward freedom with clarity and dignity. I paused briefly at the threshold, feeling the cool air of the evening brush my skin, the subtle sounds of the neighborhood, distant laughter, a dog barking, leaves rustling, grounding me in the present. I glanced back, not with anger, not with longing, but with quiet acknowledgement. The man who had believed he controlled the narrative of my life now understood, without words, that he no longer could. As I stepped outside, the sensation was almost surreal. I carried no bag, no suitcase, only the quiet knowledge of my own agency, my awareness, and the deliberate choice to leave behind deceit without letting it define me. Each movement was measured, calm, reflective, a silent message that strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply walks away. The street felt wider, the evening softer, the horizon open. I breathed slowly, deliberately, allowing each inhale to fill me with a sense of possibility, each exhale releasing the weight of betrayal, confusion, and quiet hurt. There was no rush, no dramatic escape, only a gentle unfolding of life, deliberate, calm, and entirely mine. David remained in the doorway, a silhouette of someone realizing too late that his actions had consequences far beyond his understanding. And in that quiet moment, I felt not anger, not resentment, but the profound peace of having reclaimed myself. My presence, my steps, my deliberate calm, all spoke louder than words ever could. I walked into the evening with quiet confidence. No one noticed, no one shouted, yet the shift was complete. I was no longer defined by betrayal, by hidden truths, by the manipulation of another. I was defined by my own choices, my own clarity, and my calm, deliberate freedom. And in that silent, reflective walk, I felt the subtle joy of liberation. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply, profoundly real. The goodbye didn't need volume. Its power was in its quiet certainty, its measured presence, and the unwavering knowledge that I was finally, fully free. Weeks later, I found a small envelope tucked quietly among the bills and notes in my drawer. The handwriting was familiar, deliberate, and it immediately drew my attention. I held it in my hands for a moment, feeling the weight of words not yet read, the calm anticipation of understanding someone else's quiet acknowledgement. It was from Mark. He had taken time, carefully choosing his words, and in them, I found a gentle gratitude that resonated deeply. "You saved me from living a lie," he wrote. There was no dramatics, no overblown emotion, only quiet recognition, the kind that comes from truth and clarity finally being acknowledged. I folded the letter carefully, placing it in my journal beside my own last entry, a reflection, an observation, and a quiet record of everything I had felt, seen and understood over the weeks. The letter, delicate and understated, was a confirmation of what I had quietly known all along, that subtle actions, patience and deliberate clarity could ripple outward, affecting not just me, but others caught in the shadows of deceit. As I read the words again, I felt a calm satisfaction, a quiet joy that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with truth and presence. Mark had seen, he had understood, and his acknowledgement was a silent reward for careful observation, thoughtful action, and deliberate patience. I placed the letter back in the drawer, gently closing it, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers, the faint scent of lavender lingering from the sachet I had tucked nearby. The house, once heavy with tension and quiet betrayal, now carried a subtle, measured peace. Each small detail, the journal, the letter, the quiet moments of reflection, formed a tapestry of resilience, awareness, and deliberate calm. The week passed in careful observation. Each morning I watched David leave for work, noting the subtle changes in his routine. The cologne, the hurried glances at his phone, the faint tension in his shoulders, it all told a story he thought I couldn't read. But I was reading it, every word, every gesture. I began to test him in small ways. I mentioned innocuous things, Meetings, colleagues, errands, watching for the flicker of guilt or hesitation in his eyes. Sophie's name never crossed my lips, but the invisible weight of her presence lingered in the air, and he knew I could sense it. One evening, he mentioned an upcoming business trip with a forced casualness. I nodded, sipping my wine, calm and collected. Inside, I traced the steps of what I would do. This was no longer about anger or revenge. It was about clarity, about quietly reclaiming the life I had thought lost. Every move I made was deliberate, every smile measured. The power wasn't in confrontation. It was in the subtle assertion of my awareness. By the end of the week, I had mapped out a delicate strategy. I didn't need a storm, I needed precision, and I felt it. The quiet satisfaction of knowing I could dismantle the illusion he'd built without ever raising my voice. That night, the house was still, but the air felt different. I sat by the window, journal open, pen poised. Outside, the neighborhood lights flickered softly, ordinary and indifferent. But inside, I held something extraordinary: knowledge, clarity, and the quiet power of a woman who had finally opened her eyes. David's breathing sounded steady from the bedroom. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel hurt or betrayed in the way I had before. Instead, I felt control, observation, presence. I had begun reclaiming my life. Piece by piece, one careful, deliberate step at a time. I closed the journal and whispered softly, almost as if to the house itself, "I see now, and I will not be blind again." The silence carried weight, a weight he could never suspect. The woman who had been hurt and naive had returned, but stronger, clearer, deliberate, and quietly unstoppable. And as I stood, looking at the familiar rooms with new eyes, I realized this was not the end. It was a beginning written in patience, in observation, and in a calm, unyielding reclaiming of my own life. Because sometimes the loudest power isn't in the storm. It's in the quiet eye that watches, waits, and moves with unwavering purpose. My story is not about anger. It's about observation, patience, and clarity. Sometimes strength doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers, "I know the truth, and I'm free." The words felt natural on my lips, carrying with them the weight of months of reflection and the quiet satisfaction of having reclaimed my life without losing my dignity. Thank you for listening to my story. Sometimes silence teaches more than words. Don't forget to subscribe and share your own story in the comments. Maybe your voice will be next on Her Voice.